Betty Broderick passed away today in prison at the age of 78. In honor of Betty's case, and as the most notorious case of a woman scorned, we're going to be doing a dive into the Betty Broderick case. Betty Broderick was born as Elizabeth Ann Bishelia on November 7, 1947. And as a 17-year-old first-year student at St. Vincent College, she traveled to go see a football game at Notre Dame University. And at this football game is where she meets her future husband, Dan Broderick. Dan was 21 and a senior at Notre Dame University. Now, after Betty and Dan have been dating for a short while, Dan very early on in the relationship expresses his deep desire and want to marry Betty. And Betty said many times he never wavered on wanting to marry her. Eventually, Betty and Dan marry, and in April of 1969, Betty returns from their honeymoon pregnant with their first child, her daughter Kim. Shortly after Kim's birth, Dan finally graduates with his medical degree, and then suddenly he springs this idea on Betty. He has this deep desire to continue his education, and he wants to combine his medical degree with a law degree. That's a lot of freaking school. Dan then very soon enrolls at Harvard Law. But unfortunately for Betty, she would have to continue being the main provider for the family while Dan is in school. Betty at one point was even working up to 3 jobs to try and keep the family afloat while Dan is pursuing this law degree. Now, during this time frame, Betty gives birth to 4 more children. Her daughter Lee in 1971, her son Daniel in 1976, her son Rhett in 1979, and an unnamed boy who passed away 4 days after he was born. But things finally start looking up for Betty in 1973 when Dan finally graduates law school. Right after graduating, Dan is hired by a very large law firm. It is in fact the largest law firm in San Diego, California. Betty packs up the family and they move out to San Diego, specifically the La Jolla area of San Diego. Now, through all this, Betty continues to work part-time, selling Avon and Tupperware, while still raising her children. Life is looking up, and Betty and Dan are living their best life and raising their family. Betty's years of hard work are finally starting to pay off because Dan has this high-powered career. And it starts getting even better because in 1978, after 5 years of working for that very large law firm in San Diego, Dan decides to open his own practice. So Dan leaves that law firm and opens up his own small private law firm, specializing in medical malpractice. But in the fall of 1982, Dan hires a 21-year-old Linda Kolkina. Linda was a former Delta Airlines flight attendant, and Dan hires her as his new assistant at this law firm. And as early as October 1983, Betty starts to suspect that Dan is having an affair with his new assistant, Linda. But Dan would adamantly deny this, even going as far as calling Betty Looney Tunes for even suggesting it. And for the next 2 years, Betty spends her time in between thinking she's probably going crazy or Dan is indeed having an affair with Linda. And no matter how many times that Betty has called Dan out for lies and just point blank asked him if he's having an affair with Linda, Dan would constantly deny it, gaslight Betty, and tell her that she's literally insane, that he is not having an affair with Linda. And this is literally eating Betty up inside because she knows something is going on. Dan's acting funny. So needing some advice on the situation, Betty calls up one of her best and closest friends, and she tells her friend, I think Dan is having an affair with Linda. And the friend's advice to Betty was, hey, Dan's birthday is coming up. What you should do is get him a nice gift or whatever and go to that office and make yourself a presence at that office. So Betty does just that. She gets a nice bottle of champagne. She makes herself look really nice. She dresses all up and she heads down to Dan's office. But when she gets there, nobody's in the office except for the receptionist. And the office is trashed. There's birthday wrapping everywhere, confetti, streamers, multiple empty bottles of champagne all across his office. We asked the receptionist, like, where's Dan? You know, what did he have a party? Like, what happened here? And the receptionist just point blank tells Betty, no, it was just Dan and Linda, and they went out to lunch. So Betty waits around in the office for hours waiting for Dan and Linda to finish up this lunch. And finally, Betty just moseys on home, where Dan eventually shows up hours later, very obviously drunk. But Dan still adamantly denies, even after this, that him and Linda are not having an affair. And in February of 1985, Dan invites Betty out to dinner, where Dan then sits Betty down in this very public restaurant and tells her he's moving out of the house. He says all of Betty's allegations